You are standing on the banks of a river in Germany, and the water has stopped, not because of a truce or a holiday, but because of this, the rower, a body of water that in any other context would be an unremarkable feature of the landscape. But here, in the final months of the war in Europe, it is a wall, a cold, wide, and implacable barrier between the U.S. Army and the heart of the Third Reich. Your mission is to get a 30-ton Sherman tank across that river. The bridges are destroyed. The enemy is watching from the other side, and your orders are to make the impossible happen, not in weeks, but in hours. This is the story of what happened next. It's a story not of generals and grand strategy, but of sergeants with blowtorches and a pile of discarded oil drums. It's the story of one of the strangest, most brilliant, and most forgotten acts of battlefield ingenuity in World War II. By February 1945, the Allied war machine was a juggernaut. After the breakout from Normandy and the brutal winter counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the push into Germany was relentless. But the Wehrmacht, though battered, was not broken. As they retreated, they executed a scorched earth policy with chilling efficiency, and their primary target was infrastructure. Every bridge, every culvert, every crossing over the numerous rivers of Western Germany was systematically blown. It was a strategy designed to do what the German army no longer could: slow the Allied advance to a crawl. The Rauper River was the centerpiece of this defense, wider and swifter than the river the Allies had crossed in France. Its banks were steep and muddy, perfect for defensive positions. For weeks, the U.S. First Army sat and waited, staring across the water at an enemy that could retreat at will. The plan, codenamed Operation Grenade, called for a massive assault across the Roer, but it was entirely dependent on the engineers. Without bridges, the tanks, the artillery, the fuel, and the food that formed the lifeblood of the offensive would be stuck on the wrong side of the river. The standard solution was a Bailey Bridge, a prefabricated portable truss bridge that could be assembled by engineers under fire. But building a Bailey Bridge took time, materials, and a degree of engineering skill that was difficult to muster under direct observation and artillery fire. The Germans knew this. They had their guns zeroed in on every likely crossing point. The moment the first engineer panel hit the ground, the shells would start falling. The U.S. Army needed another way. It needed a trick. Enter the men of the 11th Engineer Combat Group. These were not the stereotypical soldiers of frontline combat. They were mechanics, carpenters, welders, and construction workers in civilian life. Their war was fought with slide rules, blueprints, and sheer physical grit. They were the ultimate problem solvers, and their problem on this day was monumental. They needed to get armor across the river now. The idea, when it came, was born of pure necessity and the resources at hand. All across the staging area, the landscape was littered with thousands of empty 55-gallon fuel drums. The Army ran on gasoline, and these steel containers were the detritus of that logistical chain. To most, they were just junk. But to a practical mind, a mind trained to see potential in raw materials, they were something else. They were flotation devices. The concept was almost absurdly simple. A 55-gallon drum, when sealed, displaces roughly 55 gallons of water. That's about 440 pounds of buoyancy. A fully loaded M4 Sherman tank weighed around 35 tons, or 70,000 pounds. Simple math told them they would need at least 160 drums just to keep the tank afloat, with many more needed for a safety margin and to account for the weight of the raft itself. They were going to build a raft, a massive, ungainly, and deeply strange raft, out of oil drums, and they were going to drive a main battle tank across it. This wasn't a plan that came from a high command or a manual. This was garage-level engineering, conceived on the fly by men who understood physics not from a textbook, but from a lifetime of making things work. The leader of this effort, a composite of several historical figures we'll call Sergeant First Class Miller, was a former bridge construction foreman from Ohio. He looked at the tank, then at the drums, then at the river, and saw not an impossible problem, but a set of variables to be solved. The work began immediately. There was no time for formal planning or drawing up blueprints. Miller directed his men with a series of sharp, economical commands. They hauled the drums down to the riverbank, their steel bodies clanking like a dissonant bell choir. The first task was to lash them together. Using steel cables and chains, they created a massive pontoon, a floating platform 30 feet wide and 50 feet long. It was a chaotic-looking structure, a jumble of cylinders held together by brute force and welding torches. Next came the deck. They scavenged heavy timber and steel planking, nailing and welding a surface onto the barrel framework. It had to be strong enough to support the immense concentrated weight of the tank's tracks and suspension. Every nail hammered, every weld laid down, was done with the knowledge that a single failure would send 35 tons of steel plunging into the icy water. The sound of their work, the hiss of acetylene torches, the shouts of men straining against the weight of the materials, the constant, unnerving rumble of distant artillery, was the soundtrack of desperation. You can feel the tension in the air. The cold February mud seeps into your boots. Your hands are raw and greasy from handling the cables. Every few minutes, you glance up at the far bunk, a dark, menacing line of trees where you know German spotters are watching, waiting. You and your team are exposed, a perfect target silhouetted against the water. The clock is now just ticking. It's a bomb waiting to go off. As the raft took shape, a new problem emerged: how to get the tank onto it. A simple ramp would be too steep and would likely collapse under the tank's weight. Miller's solution was characteristically direct. They drove the Sherman to the water's edge, its massive 76mm gun pointing skyward. Then, using the tank's own immense power, they winched the raft into position, its front edge nudging the bank. They then used the tank's dozer blade, if it had one, or the sheer force of its engine, to push its way up the gently sloping deck they had built onto the front of the raft. It was a delicate, terrifying operation of man and machine, a high-stakes ballet of steel and muscle. The moment the tank's first track rolled onto the raft, a collective hush fell over the engineers. The massive structure groaned, a deep metallic sound of protest. Hundreds of barrels disappeared beneath the surface, swallowed by the brown river. Water surged over the deck, swirling around the tank's bogie wheels. For a heart-stopping second, it looked as if the entire contraption would simply sink, taking the tank and its crew with it. But it held. The calculations were correct. The raft settled, riding low in the water, but stable. The tank, a beast designed for land, was now a ship. The driver, a young man who had probably never imagined this scenario in his training, inched the vehicle forward until it was centered on the deck. The engine, now muffled by the proximity of the water, thrummed with a low, powerful vibration that could be felt through the soles of the engineer's boots. The crossing itself was an exercise in controlled terror. Using a system of ropes and winches on both banks, the engineers began to pull the raft across the river. It moved with agonizing slowness, a bizarre makeshift ferry that was the most vulnerable thing on the battlefield. To any German observer, it must have looked like a joke, a suicidal folly. But on that day, it was dead serious. Imagine you are in that tank. The world outside your periscope is a churning mess of water and steel. You can't see the cables pulling you, can't hear the shouted commands of the men on the banks. All you feel is the gentle, sickening sway of the raft and the constant gnawing fear that a single shell, a single lucky machine gun burst, could send you to the bottom. Your life is in the hands of the men who built this strange vessel, and the physics that are, for now, on your side. When the tank's treads finally bit into the mud of the eastern bank, a cheer went up from the men on the western shore, a raw, ragged sound of relief and disbelief. The Sherman didn't hesitate. It powered up the bank, its engine roaring as it left the water behind and disappeared into the tree line. It was the first American tank to cross the Roer at this point, without a bridge. It was a crack in the wall, a proof of concept that was as audacious as it was effective. They did it again and again. Using the same raft, they ferried more tanks, half-tracks, and vital equipment across the river. Each crossing was as nerve-wracking as the last, but the method worked. The Germans, confused by this unorthodox tactic, were slow to react. Their artillery, calibrated for bridge-building activities, was less effective against this small, mobile target. The engineers, working under the cover of darkness and the smoke they created, had found a way to bypass the enemy's primary defense. This strange tactic, the floating of tanks on barrels, had an impact far beyond the few vehicles it moved. It was a psychological victory. It was a message to the waiting infantry that the obstacles in their path could be overcome with American ingenuity. It was a testament to the decentralized, problem-solving culture of the U.S. Army, where a sergeant in the field was empowered to solve a problem that was stalling an entire Army group. It was the physical manifestation of the can-do spirit. The success of the barrel rafts didn't replace the need for proper bridges. The 11th and other engineer units continued their grueling work, building Bailey bridges under fire, often at tremendous cost. But the rafts bought them something invaluable: time. They allowed armored elements to get across the river early, securing the bridgehead and protecting the engineers as they worked on the more permanent crossings. It was a stopgap measure, a brilliant jury-rigged solution that filled a critical gap. What this story reveals is the hidden reality of warfare. History often focuses on the generals, the tanks, the planes, the big, obvious symbols of power. But wars are won or lost by countless small, unseen acts of ingenuity, courage, and sheer determination. They are won by men like Sergeant Miller and his crew, who looked at an impossible problem and didn't see a dead end, but a pile of raw materials. The barrel raft tactic was not a unique one-off event. Similar improvisations happened throughout the war, on all fronts, from the British Hobart's Funnies, a range of modified tanks designed for specific tasks like clearing mines or bridging gaps, to the Soviet use of tractors In armored assaults, necessity has always been the mother of military invention. But the image of a massive Sherman tank, a symbol of American industrial might, precariously balanced on a raft of scavenged oil drums, remains one of the most potent and humbling examples of this principle. It strips away the glamour of war and reveals its gritty improvisational core. Today, the Roer River, now called the Ruhr, flows peacefully through a landscape of green fields and quiet towns. There are no monuments to the barrel rafts, no plaques commemorating the engineers who built them. Their story lives on in obscure military engineering manuals and in the memories of the few men who are left to tell it. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, not just as a curious footnote in military history, but as a powerful lesson in what human beings can achieve when they are pushed to the absolute limit of their creativity. The next time you see a tank, remember this. Remember that its power is not just in its gun or its armor, but in the minds of the people who support it, the people who can look at a pile of junk and see a bridge, a way forward, a solution. The most powerful weapon on any battlefield is not a piece of hardware, but an idea. And sometimes the most brilliant ideas are the strangest ones. If this story of wartime ingenuity and problem-solving under pressure has given you a new perspective on the realities of combat, share it with someone who appreciates the untold stories of history.